Uh-huh.
Yeah. All right, great. So, good day, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Angeliki, and should I? Yeah, great. Now you can hear me better. My name is Angeliki Giannisi, and I am a PhD candidate in ATTP, supervised by Vera Bühlmann. Thank you. And my presentation today is titled Forging Pacts of Friendship, Architecture, and the Ethnic Domain. So I am a PhD candidate in architecture theory, but I'm also a practicing architect, I should mention. So this is a presentation on befriending and the contemplation of a concept relating to architecture that Susanne Langer puts forward in her chapter, The Modes of Virtual Space, in her book, Feeling and Form, the concept of the ethnic domain as the basic abstraction of architecture. So as an architect equally interested in practice and theory, I wonder what the implications for art and architecture would be if this domain could be thought through the lenses of mathematics and language. So we're starting with a slight detour. Susanne Langer, in her text Deceptive Analogies, Species and Real Relationships Among the Arts, from her book Problems of Art, informs us that Western thought has oscillated between two poles when it came to arts and their classifications. On the one hand, the assertion that the arts are fundamentally one, an ultimate union, and on the other, that they need to be separated into discrete categories. The prevailing tendency, she observes, is to treat any intimate relation as identity, in other words, to collapse difference into sameness, but then to wonder why art has indeed so many names. Langer diagnoses this collapse as a symptom of conceptual confusion, which is possibly incited by language. Could the relations between the arts be merely a matter of dictionary exhaustion? I would like to ponder the possibility of navigating the obstacle of the unity and interrelation of the arts with the help of the ethnic domain. Indeed, this is a concept where the issue of language reappears with a vexed role that the word function plays in it. My proposal is that Langer perhaps approaches the role of function through a mathematical relation to language, one that has received little attention and that resonates strongly with the category theoretical way of thinking in mathematics. In her chapter, The Modes of Virtual Space, Langer argues that architecture introduces a third, more subtle mode of virtual space compared to painting and sculpture, neither purely scenic nor organic, but arguably the most ambitious of all artistic illusions. Its illusory character is easy to overlook because buildings serve vital practical needs such as shelter, comfort, and safety. These utilitarian functions are so prominent that even architects have disagreed about architecture's nature. Some see it as chiefly practical with only incidental aesthetic value, others treat it as applied art, and others subordinate everything to functional demands. Yet in no other art does the tension between appearance and reality becomes so acute, according to Langer. Nope. Let me stop for a bit. Hmm. Nevertheless, architecture is a plastic art, and its first achievement is an illusion, something purely imagined or conceptual translated into visual form, she writes. In this final sentence, we start listening to Langer's suggestion that something different might be at stake with the notion of function, and once we proceed deeper into the text, we can hear her challenging the term's meaning, which no longer appears to be a monopoly of utility or convenient arrangement, but is rather related to the notion of functional form. Even though Langer proclaims that buildings are not in fact active beings themselves, she does shift our attention to one of Moholy Nagy's descriptions regarding the nature of architecture in space. A constant fluctuation, sideways and upward, radiant, all-sided, announces to man that he has taken possession of imponderable, invisible, and yet omnipresent space. The selection of Moholy Nagy's language doesn't focus on the common sense conception of space as a passive receptacle. A broad spectrum of adjectives that Langer collects from different architects attests to an idea of space that resists measurement and perhaps is active, living, activated, organic, omnipresent. Langer speaks about an invisible domain that architecture has the capacity to articulate and that nonetheless extends its channels to the physical world. She develops this idea further by bending the concept of functionalism. Just as a living being's actual surroundings consist of a network of practical functional relationships, so too the virtual environment that architecture creates stands as a symbol of that functional existence. However, the symbolic dimension has nothing to do with signs of practical activities, such as hooks for hanging tools, comfortable benches, or well-placed doors. Symbolic expression is utterly different from useful planning or efficient arrangement. It is functional in a different way. Perhaps the functional existence of architecture is about creating an experience that sustains an aliveness, like the act of breathing, in which inside and outside can be constantly inverted. To create an entry point into the mathematical sense of function, I want to turn briefly to Ernst Cassirer's distinction between Funktionsbegriff and Substanzbegriff from his book with the same title. Cassirer draws a sharp line between two kinds of concepts. Substantive concepts, so other think concepts, in other words, that treat things as bundles of properties, and relation concepts that treat elements as positions in a system. Cassirer argues that you cannot find largeness or doubleness as a property inside any object the way you find color or weight. These are not qualities that inhere in things. Rather, they are relations that we actively establish between things through acts of judgment. The function is not in the thing, it is what we do with things when we place them in ordered systems. This presents a radical departure from the logic of substance. The function does not copy or represent, it places, and it has a performative role. Cassirer is careful to distinguish this notion of function from a mere rule for generating new elements. Instead, the serial form is an invariant structure that determines what counts as a member at all. Function here operates like a mask that covers the manifold of rational numbers and assigns to each a role without introducing any new content or meaning beyond that positional index. This brings us closer to a category theoretical understanding of function, though Cassirer does not use that language. A functor in those terms maps objects and morphisms while preserving and transferring structure between categories. Cassirer's function operates analogously, but at a simpler level within a category and between sets. The function maps its element of a manifold to a positional index within a relational system, and it maps transformations of the manifold to transformations of those indices, all while preserving the system's form. In other words, the function acts like a functor within a category. This boundedness between element and index and between function and functor is mechanical, and natural transformations describe the process of mapping between different functors. At this point, I want to open an analogy to create a channel into the technicality of mathematics and relate it also to language. The analogy is that mathematics is to the arts as Simonides' rhetorics is to language. So drawing on Anne Carson's reading of Simonides of Chaos in her book Economy of the Unlost, I want to discuss briefly how Simonides' rhetorical practice, his invention of the art of memory or mnemotechnics, already embodies something quite close to what is at stake with category theoretical thinking in mathematics today. A brief excursion into the story of Scopas and the collapsed roof. Simonides of Chaos, active during the 5th century BC, was the first professional poet who traveled between the houses of wealthy patrons, composing victory odes, epitaphs, and encomia in exchange for payment. As narrated by Cicero, Simonides is also responsible for the invention of the art of memory. So the story goes as follows. Simonides was dining at the house of a Thessalian noble named Scopas. He had composed the song in Scopas' honor, but he had included extended praise of the divine twins, Castor and Polydeuces. Because of this incident, Scopas declared that he would pay only half the agreed fee. Shortly afterwards, as Simonides stood at the door, the roof of the dining hall collapsed, killing Scopas and all of his guests. Simonides, by remembering the exact place where each guest had been seated at the table, was able to recall the names of everybody involved in the dinner. From this disaster, Simonides is said to have invented the ars memoria. The technique was based on remembering a set of data and placing them in a fixed spatial order. What interests me here is the mechanics of memory. Simonides does not remember Scopas by recalling his face, his character, or any property inherent to him. He remembers him as the body in the fourth seat from the door. The position determines the identification. The function of memory here is not representational, but mechanical. What Simonides invents is not merely a memory trick, but a mnemonic machine, a fixed grid of positions that can be applied again and again. The seating chart becomes an objective memory independent of any individual's recollection. Now back to Langer. She introduces the ethnic domain as an invisible virtual space that architecture articulates, which is not a thing among other things. As a domain, it is the sphere of influence of a function or functions. It may have physical effects on some geographical locality, or it may not. A nomadic camp, a ship at sea, a circus on the move, these are all self-contained places whose identity is not tied to geographical location. The camp can move to a different place, and yet it remains the same camp as its internal relational order persists under translation. This is invariance in the sense of Cassir's Funktionsbegriff. The camp's ethnic domain is not a property of any geographical spot, but a functional order that can be mapped onto any terrain whatsoever. In category-theoretic terms, the camp is preserved through a functorial process or natural transformation, a virtual category of positions that stays unchanged as its physical manifold shifts. So what does Langer mean by function in this context? As already mentioned, she first notes the common utilitarian sense of the word shelter, comfort, safety, which leads to the error of functionalism. In other words, reducing architecture to convenient arrangement. Yet she also points to a different meaning, as mentioned before, that of functional form. Buildings are not living beings, and yet they can operate organically, embodying the rhythms of life, systole and diastole, making and unmaking, crescendo and diminuendo. Here, function no longer means purpose. Rather, function operates like a metabolic pattern and resonates with Cassir's function that operates like a mask. The mask determines the role of each element only by its position in the relational whole. Here, form neither follows nor precedes function. Form is the functioning of the invariance across changing contents. Langer's approach to the role of function, strongly influenced by Cassir's distinction between function and substance, seeks a philosophy of the act. Acts that want to construct models that realize and which are not willed by a subject but that operate in an impersonal, automatic way. The act of being placed, of finding oneself already responding to an order that precedes and exceeds any individual intention. The operation of this act has a double character. It is both algorithmic, a step-by-step procedure that can be repeated, and it's also mnemonic. It conserves traces of what has been placed. Architecture in Langer's sense operates similarly to a sundial. Like a sundial that receives light, inscribing the sun's course on the ground, marking the hour and becoming information, so does a building receive light, accommodating its variations. Langer quotes Le Corbusier, who said, "Architecture is the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. But light is a variable factor. Therefore, the elements of architecture must be protean to the extent of allowing freely and safely for the radical transformations that changes of light will make. In good buildings, such changes are a source of richness and life. Unusual lights bring out new forms, but all forms are beautiful, and every change yields a complete perceptible mood. The building that receives light in this way is an illusion that changes with every shift of light, yet remains itself. The ethnic domain preserves this illusion and as an abstraction focuses on functional form. And yet this abstraction does not distance us from reality. Rather, one could say that it organizes reality so that concrete friendships can be forged. Langer's own examples of architecture are telling. Temples, tombs, theaters, places of communion between humans and gods, between the living and the dead, between people and cosmos. The cosmic and the physical are brought into communion. The temple, as she writes, though oriented by the equinox points, merely symbolizes the corners of the earth to simple people who probably did not understand the astronomical scheme at all. The temple really made their greater world of space, nature, the abode of gods, and ghosts, and as it presented this space to popular thought, it unified earth and heaven, men and gods. Here, the friendship forged is not only horizontal between guest and host, but it's also vertical between the human and the divine. These are pacts that rely on faith, pacts that come to terms with an incommensurable remainder. This is perhaps why architecture's functional existence can be likened to the act of breathing, an involuntary rhythm where inside and outside are constantly inverted, a process akin to natural transformations in category theory, where inversions are performed to resolve an equation. The possibility of intimacy is given with breath as an interval, enabling a constant process of change and inversion that nevertheless can sustain a relation between at least two strangers. Thus, mathematics and architecture are alike. Both are arts of placement in a constellation of heterogeneous elements rather than representation, creating setups akin to the dining table in the Simonides story. Both replace the question, what is it, with the question, where does it stand and how does it relate to? And both, in doing so, create the conditions for a different kind of relation, which enables cohabitation rather than domination. This brings us back to the question with which we began. How can the arts be distinct yet unified, and how could the ethnic domain be thought of as a model for unity? What the ethnic domain offers maybe is a third path. It creates a model of unity that is neither classificatory nor synthetic. Instead, it is relational and operational, a tracing of shared positions within a functional order. This is a space that forges pacts between architectural types, between the arts themselves, and between the arts and sciences and other seemingly different domains. As Langer notes, albeit in an indirect way, abstraction is not a flight from the concrete. In fact, the abstract and the concrete are always implicated with one another. The ethnic domain might be abstract, and yet it is always embodied in architecture. It works like a sieve. It filters out geographical location, building materials, and blood relations, leaving only the invariant functional order. The camp moves from one patch of ground to another, yet it remains the same camp because its relational order is invariant under translation. In this context, friendship is the reconciliation to that invariance from within. Two inhabitants of the same ethnic domain do not become friends by sharing a psychological state or agreeing on a set of beliefs. They become friends when each tunes their own position to the position of the other without collapsing the two into one. Occupying analogous roles in the same functional order, they remain distinct. Reconciliation is a pact to be forged, a bond that binds distinct elements into a living whole, and this pact implies a faith without naming it, the willingness to occupy a vicarious position, to become a stranger to one's own certainties. Thus, the unity of the arts and the unity of any community that architecture shelters works operationally, in the sense that unity is not found in a common substance or origin, but in the repeatable, transformable relations that hold among distinct elements. An operational unity is simply performed by establishing bridges between different domains. In the ethnic domain, function and functor are intertwined in multiple ways within one domain and across many. Because of this operational unity, they can be tuned to each other, both internally and externally. Both directions require crossing, stepping out and into places, becoming a stranger and remembering who one is, all of which allow transformations to happen. This perhaps is the point Langer speaks of, where the deeper structural devices reveal the principles of dynamic form. A point of crossing that accommodates the simultaneous presence of distinct art genera, architecture, music, painting, or sculpture, without collapsing their differences, but rather allows them to enter into a friendly relation. It is the point where the ethnic domain of architecture befriends the architectonic of thought, and where the arts and sciences, no longer estranged, find themselves already in conversation. Perhaps we can imagine this point that Langer describes at the end of her essay on deceptive analogies as the point of a momentary convergence between form and feeling, where art aspires towards the condition of music. And to complement this idea with another musical analogy by architect Dom van der Laan, a musical scale is defined only by the intervals between notes, not by absolute pitch. The desired pitch must be determined through the tuning of the instrument before a performance. So too, the ethnic domain works like a scale of relational positions, tuning the intervals of possible friendships. Thank you.
Very much to the fundamental land and architecture. And we have the discussion now, so therefore, yeah, would you mind come to